There's a mass exodus happening that nobody's talking about. The most conscious, awake, and psychologically developed people are quietly withdrawing from society. Not angrily, not dramatically, they're just disappearing, going off-grid, leaving social media, abandoning careers, ending relationships, choosing solitude over society. Carl Jung predicted this. He called it the necessary withdrawal, when someone becomes so psychologically conscious that participating in collective unconsciousness becomes physically painful. Not metaphorically painful. Actually, somatically, psychologically painful. I'm about to explain why Jung believed this disappearance isn't just inevitable for awakening people, it's essential. Why the more conscious you become, the less you can tolerate normal society. And why this isn't spiritual bypassing or escapism. It's the psyche's survival mechanism when surrounded by mass unconsciousness. If you've been feeling the pull to withdraw, to disappear, to leave it all behind, Jung would say you're not antisocial. You're becoming too conscious for the collective container. Here's what Jung understood that explains everything. Society runs on collective unconsciousness. Shared delusions, mass projections, agreed upon shadows. These aren't bugs in the system. They are the system. And it only works if everyone participates unconsciously. The moment someone wakes up, really wakes up, not just intellectually but psychologically, they become a glitch in the matrix. They can see the projections everyone else is living. They recognize the shadows everyone's avoiding. They understand the games everyone's playing unconsciously. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Jung experienced this personally. As his consciousness expanded, he found normal social interaction increasingly unbearable. Not because he was arrogant, but because he was awake in a room full of people talking in their sleep. Every conversation required him to pretend he didn't see what he saw, didn't know what he knew, didn't understand what was really happening beneath the surface. This is the curse of consciousness. You become psychologically alone, even when physically surrounded. You're speaking a different language, seeing different dimensions, operating from a different reality. And the effort required to bridge that gap, to constantly translate between your consciousness and collective unconsciousness, becomes exhausting. So the awakened start disappearing. Not because they hate society, but because staying in it requires them to betray their consciousness. Every day demands they pretend to be asleep. Every interaction requires they dim their light. Every relationship asks them to be less than they've become. And eventually, the psyche says, enough. Withdraw. Preserve your consciousness. Stop letting the collective unconscious drain what you've worked so hard to develop. Jung discovered that as you integrate your personal shadow, the collective shadow becomes unbearable to witness. You're watching an entire society projecting its darkness while denying it exists. When you've faced your own capacity for evil, watching others project theirs onto scapegoats becomes agonizing. When you've integrated your own darkness, seeing society's shadow projections, the other political party is evil. That group is the problem. Those people are what's wrong. Feels like watching a mass psychosis, because that's exactly what it is. Jung called this the burden of seeing. The awakened person sees that most social conflicts are just shadow projections. Wars are collective shadows clashing. Political divisions are mass projections. Social media's outrage is collective shadow material seeking targets. Once you see this, participating becomes impossible. You can't join the mob when you see it's hunting its own shadow. You can't pick sides when you understand both sides are projecting. You can't engage in collective blame when you recognize it as collective unconsciousness. So you withdraw, not from superiority, but from psychological necessity. One of Jung's students described it perfectly. I used to have strong political opinions. Then I integrated my shadow and saw that my opinions were just projections. Now, when I see political debates, I see two groups of people violently projecting their unconscious material at each other while calling it justice or truth. I can't participate anymore. It would be like joining a mass delusion. But here's what's really happening. The awakened aren't just seeing the collective shadow, they're feeling it. When you become conscious, you become energetically sensitive. Being around unconscious shadow projection feels like psychological violence. It's not judgment, it's genuine energetic incompatibility. Jung noticed this in his own life. After his individuation, being in crowds became almost unbearable. Not because he disliked people, but because he could feel the unconscious material swirling. The projections, repressions, shadows, all creating a psychological storm that only he seemed aware of. This is why awakened people disappear from social media first. It's a 24/7 shadow projection machine. Every scroll is an assault of unconscious material. Every comment section is a shadow boxing ring. For someone who's integrated their shadow, it's like being forced to watch people punch themselves while blaming others for the bruises. Jung's second insight: once you've individuated toward your authentic self, performing your persona becomes impossible, and society demands nothing but persona performance. Before awakening, you could play the social games unconsciously, smile when expected, say the right things, perform your role. But once you've touched your authentic self, that deeper truth beyond all masks, going back to persona performance feels like psychological death. Every social situation demands performance. The workplace persona, the family role, the social media identity, the acceptable opinions, the appropriate emotions. For someone still identified with their persona, this feels normal. For someone who's found their self, it feels like suffocation. Jung discovered this through personal experience. After his confrontation with the unconscious, he couldn't perform the proper Swiss psychiatrist anymore. He couldn't pretend to agree with collective opinions he saw through. He couldn't maintain relationships that required him to be false. So he withdrew to Bollingen, his tower by the lake, where he could be authentically himself. This isn't antisocial, it's pro-authentic. The awakened person isn't rejecting society from anger, but from incompatibility. They've become too real for environments that require fakeness, too authentic for spaces that demand performance, too whole for containers that only accept fragments. One of Jung's patients, a successful executive who'd undergone individuation, described the impossibility. I sit in board meetings and everyone's performing their executive roles, saying what executives should say, thinking what executives should think. I can't do it anymore. It's like being asked to pretend I'm someone I've never been. My authentic self has no voice in that room. Only my persona did, and it's dead. She didn't dramatically quit. She quietly disappeared, transitioning out over months, moving to a small town where she could be real rather than successful. Not from failure, but from the success of finding herself. This is happening everywhere. The awakened are leaving careers that require persona performance, ending relationships based on false selves, abandoning social circles that demand masks. They're not failing at society, they're succeeding at authenticity. And that success makes societal participation impossible. Here's what Jung understood energetically. Maintaining consciousness in an unconscious environment requires tremendous psychological energy. And awakened people are realizing it's not sustainable. Think about what the conscious person has to do in normal society. Constantly filter out unconscious projections. Maintain boundaries against energy vampires. Translate between depth and surface. Hold their frequency while surrounded by static. Process not just their own material, but the unconscious material everyone else is leaking. Jung called this psychological labor, the invisible work conscious people do just to exist in unconscious spaces. It's exhausting. Every interaction requires you to not react to projections, not absorb others' unconscious material, not get pulled into collective dramas, not match the unconscious frequency around you, not betray your truth to maintain harmony. For unconscious people, this isn't work. They're flowing with the collective current. For conscious people, it's like swimming upstream in a tsunami of unconsciousness. Eventually, you have to get out of the water or drown. Jung noticed that his most conscious patients would develop chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses, depression, not from personal pathology, but from the exhaustion of maintaining consciousness in unconscious environments. The cure wasn't therapy. It was withdrawal from the environments draining them. One woman, a teacher who'd awakened through years of inner work, developed severe chronic fatigue. Medical tests showed nothing wrong. Through analysis with Jung, she realized she was expending massive energy maintaining her consciousness, while surrounded by unconscious colleagues and students all day. She wasn't sick. She was energetically depleted. When she left teaching and moved to a cabin in nature, her energy returned within weeks, not from rest, but from no longer having to maintain consciousness against the constant pressure of collective unconsciousness. This is why awakened people disappear to nature, to solitude, to small conscious communities, not to escape responsibility, but to preserve the consciousness they have worked so hard to develop. They understand that consciousness is precious and finite, and spending it on unconscious interactions is like pouring water into sand. Jung identified this withdrawal as archetypal, the hermit phase that every individuating person must enter, not permanently, but necessarily. The psyche requires solitude to integrate what society would fragment. The hermit archetype isn't about misanthropy. It's about psychological necessity. When you're transforming at a fundamental level, you need space from influences that would pull you back to old patterns. You need silence to hear your inner voice. You need solitude to integrate without interference. Jung himself went through profound hermit phases. His years at Bollingen weren't vacation. They were psychological necessity. He needed distance from collective consciousness to develop individual consciousness. He needed separation from others' projections to understand his own depths. This is what's happening to awakening people now. They're not disappearing because they're weak or antisocial. They're following an archetypal pattern that individuation requires. The hermit phase is when the shadow integrates without social pressure to repress it. The self emerges without persona demands. Inner wisdom develops without outer noise. Psychological transformation completes without interruption. But here's what Jung emphasized. The hermit phase isn't escape, it's preparation. The awakened person withdraws not to abandon society, but to develop something society needs. They're gestating wisdom, integrating truth, becoming what Jung called aquarium fish, beings who've adapted to depths others can't reach. One of Jung's analysans, a philosopher, disappeared from academic life for 3 years. Everyone thought he'd had a breakdown. He'd had a breakthrough. In solitude, he integrated insights that would have been impossible while maintaining his academic persona. When he returned, he brought revolutionary ideas, but they could only emerge in withdrawal from the very system they would eventually transform. The hermit phase looks like disappearance, but it's actually deepening. The awakened person isn't running away. They're going deeper than society allows. They're doing the work that can only be done in solitude, developing the consciousness that might eventually help the collective, but only after it's fully formed. Jung's final insight offers hope. The disappeared don't stay gone forever. But when they return differently, not to participate in unconsciousness, but to offer consciousness to those ready to receive it. The awakened who disappear are following the hero's journey: withdrawal, transformation, return with gifts. But the return isn't to normal society. It's to the margins, the edges, the spaces where consciousness can exist without compromise. They become what Jung called border dwellers, present but not participating, available but not absorbed. They might return as artists creating from authentic depths, healers working with individuals ready to awaken, teachers sharing with small groups of seekers, writers offering maps for other disappearing souls, guides for those beginning their withdrawal. But they never return to the mainstream. They can't. Once you've individuated, you can't de-individuate. Once you become conscious, you can't pretend unconsciousness. Once you've found yourself, you can't live from persona. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. His patients who fully individuated rarely returned to their previous lives. They created new ones, simpler, quieter, more authentic. They found ways to contribute without sacrificing consciousness. They learned to give without being consumed. One patient, a therapist who disappeared for 2 years, returned not to traditional practice, but to working with a small group of individuals going through spiritual emergency. She couldn't do general therapy anymore. Only work with those experiencing what she'd experienced. Her practice was tiny but profound. She was invisible to mainstream society, but a lifeline to those awakening. This is the model: awakened people disappearing from mass society, but reappearing in conscious pockets, creating parallel structures, building alternatives, offering depth to those seeking it while remaining invisible to those who aren't. Jung believed this was evolution in action. Not everyone awakens simultaneously. The pioneers disappear first, create new spaces, then become beacons for the next wave. What looks like abandonment is actually architecture, building the structures that will support collective awakening when it's ready. Let me synthesize Jung's complete picture of why spiritually awake people are disappearing. They can no longer tolerate the collective shadow that unconscious society projects. Their authentic self can't perform the persona that society demands. The energy required to maintain consciousness in unconscious spaces becomes unsustainable. They enter the necessary hermit phase that individuation requires. They eventually return, but only to conscious edges, not unconscious centers. This disappearance isn't failure, it's evolution, not weakness, but wisdom, not abandonment, but archetypal necessity. The awakened are following a pattern as old as consciousness itself. withdraw, transform, return transformed. Society experiences this as loss, abandonment, even betrayal. Where did all the conscious people go? Why are the wisest voices getting quieter? Why are the awakened abandoning the collective when it needs them most? But Jung would say, they're not abandoning the collective. They're preparing something for it. In their withdrawal, they're developing what collective consciousness isn't ready for yet. In their disappearance, they're creating spaces for others to disappear to. In their silence, they're gestating words the collective can't yet hear. If you're feeling the pull to disappear, Jung would want you to know, this isn't spiritual bypassing or escapism. It's psychological necessity. Your consciousness has developed to a point where participating in collective unconsciousness is no longer possible without betraying yourself. The withdrawal you're feeling isn't antisocial, it's archetypal. You're not abandoning society. You're following the hermit's path that every individuating person must walk. You're not weak for being unable to tolerate unconsciousness. You're conscious, and consciousness requires different conditions than sleep. Let yourself disappear, not forever, but for now. Find your bowling in, whether it's physical solitude or psychological distance. Stop expending your consciousness on unconscious interactions. Stop performing for audiences that can't see you. Stop translating your depth into surface terms. Your disappearance isn't selfish, it's necessary. The collective needs people who've fully individuated more than it needs people who partially participate. It needs depth more than surface, authenticity more than performance, consciousness more than conformity. And when you return, if you return, you'll return with gifts that could only be developed in disappearance. You'll offer what couldn't be offered while maintaining false belonging. You'll speak truths that couldn't be spoken while performing acceptance. The spiritually awake are disappearing because that's what awakening requires, not permanently, but necessarily. Not from hatred, but from love. Love of truth, consciousness, authenticity. Love that says, I must become whole, even if that means being alone. Jung would say, disappear consciously, withdraw with purpose. Use your hermit phase for integration, not isolation. And remember, your disappearance is preparing something. You're not leaving the collective. You're pioneering where it will eventually need to go. If you're disappearing or feeling the pull to withdraw, subscribe to this channel where I explore Jung's insights for those walking the individuation path. Watch the video on your screen now about the hermit archetype and how to use withdrawal for transformation, not escape. Remember, your disappearance isn't abandonment, it's evolution. And the collective needs evolved individuals more than it needs conforming participants.